Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to New Books in Language, a channel of the New Books Network podcast. Today we have with us Mr. Jonathan Downes, who's an editor, journalist, and historian, as well as a novelist. He's the author of the book Life in the Industrial Revolution, 1770 to 1809. He's also author of the book Discovery at Rosetta, Revealing Ancient Egypt, which was first published in 2008, and the second edition was published in 2020 by the American University of Cairo Press. And this is the book we'll be talking about today. He has also regularly written a number of articles for press and for periodicals, including History Today. Hello and welcome to the channel. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, Madam Andy. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much for joining us. So today we'll be talking about your book, Discovery at Rosetta, Revealing Ancient Egypt. Why don't we start with a very brief summary of the book, as well as if you could tell us a little bit about how you started working on this topic, what led you to this fascinating research.
Sure. Well, the book really was designed as a kind of, how shall I put it, a kind of one-stop shop, in that there was no place you could buy all of the information about the Rosetta Stone and find absolutely everything you needed to know about it, i.e. where it came from, what it is, and so forth. So, for example, I think most people have heard of the Rosetta Stone. Many people know what it looks like and know what it was, but most of us don't really know precisely what it is or what it did. So this was part of the problem. Even Egyptologists themselves were making basic errors to do with its archaeological history, i.e. when precisely it was discovered, where it was discovered, and how. So the book is really that, from beginning from discovery to decipherment, and the story itself of how it came to land up in London and not Paris or not Cairo, for example. All of this is a very twisty tale of politics, soldiers, scholars indeed, and even spies, frankly. The whole story it was absolutely magnetic when I started my research. And I started it because of, as I said, the problems I'd overheard. One of the things I found was a French reference to the Rosetta Stone was actually discovered in 1850 on a rubbish heap in Paris. And I thought, well, that's obviously not correct, because we know, for example, that it was discovered in 1799. What is this person talking about? Then another one said, no, my grandpapa brought it back in his rucksack from Egypt when he served with Napoleon. And obviously this young lady didn't understand at the time that the Rosetta Stone weighed 3/4 of a ton. So it didn't fit into a rucksack. So this is part of the problem. All of these stories leaked through the press, popular press, in the 19th century, and tended to just obscure the reality and the truth of what actually had happened. So I really wanted to put the truth plainly and simply, as much as possible, and explaining all of the antique terms we have. For example, many people are aware of the Battle of the Nile, Nelson, the Battle of the Nile. Had you heard of the Battle of the Pyramids, for example? The thing about this story is it gives a context for all of these great famous events. And this was one of the nice comments I had back from Publishers Weekly back in 2008. So thank you very much for putting it into a chronological context for us so we can see when and where all of this stuff happened. Because there were so many people doing so many different things all at the same time. It's actually quite tricky to track it all down. But how I started was it was a bit of a detective story, really, Manti, in that I was an editor at the time, editing the memoirs of a Royal Marine officer who served at Alexandria in 1801. And among his papers, I found this marvelous, great list written out in very fine handwriting, of course. It said, at the top was this marvelous title. They said, "Relics brought down from Egypt and now in the British Museum by me on the Madras, 50 guns. And I thought, oh gosh, he obviously escorted a lot of Egyptian treasures out of Egypt. And these are the things in the British Museum today. I looked down the list and I can't really express what it felt like. But when I came to item 8, my heart nearly stopped because it said, a stone bearing 3 inscriptions, black granite from Rosetta. And he didn't make any comment about these pieces in his diaries, nothing. He clearly didn't realize he had the famous Rosetta Stone in his possession. Now, the thing is, even in 1801, after 2 years, it was famous. It was famous across Europe. And this is kind of difficult for us to grasp when we think we have very fast communication, everything works quickly, everyone knows what's happening. Back then, yes, things moved a little bit slower, but my word, fame did travel. And he should have known what he had under his guard. He effectively escorted these things out of Egypt. Now, my first problem was nobody at the British Museum had ever heard of Mr. Marmaduke Wyborne, the Royal Marine officer. They hadn't any record of HMS Madras and the antiquities. Instead, as far as they were concerned, Rosetta Stone hitched up in London on HMS Egyptian under the guise of Colonel Turner. I thought, oh, what have I discovered here? So I contacted them and said, I think I found a new prime source document here. I'm not really sure what we've got. After a discussion with the keeper of the department, we worked out that this was a sort of bill of lading, and many of these would have been handed out at the dockside so that everybody knew which ship was to take what cargo. And it started me off. That's where the actual research began, because I wanted to find out why Madras was not known by the British Museum, why they didn't know about Wyborne, and how Turner happened to get hold of item 8 on Mr. Wyborne's list. That's where it began. And it took me a good 2 or 3 years before I got to the bottom of everything.
Okay. It's a fascinating story. So let's zoom in on the different parts of this story. Let's start with the French conquest of Egypt and how the Rosetta Stone was accidentally discovered by the French army in an Egyptian fort, as you write about it. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing is that you're actually speaking to me now. I'm in Cape Town. And the whole story doesn't actually begin in Egypt at all. It begins down here. In 1795, the French Revolution had spread, if you can imagine, the crowned heads of Europe regarding it as a kind of disease, spreading around, infecting the nearest monarchy. Oh my, what are we going to do? Well, the Prince of Orange fled for safety to England, and England sent a fleet down to the Cape to make sure that they weren't going to side with the French, the new revolution. They basically conquered the Cape in a very kindly sort of way. They landed 1,000 men, threatened all the gun positions and so forth, and the Dutch East India Company agreed. This is it, they'll now follow the Prince of Orange. Thank you very much. The result was France could now no longer get its ships safely from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean around the Cape, because there were British ships down there who would attack them now that they were at war. What was the alternative? Napoleon Bonaparte was a very powerful general, very popular. The people loved him. He had done tremendous things for the revolution. He had just conquered. He was about to go off to Italy, and when he got back as the great victor who had defeated the Austrians, he needed something exciting, and what he really wanted to do was conquer Egypt, because he knew his history very well, and he was familiar with the ancient Suez Canal. He had the idea of cutting open the Suez Canal, sailing his ships up the Nile, through the canal, and into the Red Sea. From there, he would then travel through the Indian Ocean and attack the English at India. This was the huge strategy that the Directory government wanted to pursue. The only problem was Egypt itself. It was part of quite possibly the largest empire in the world at the time, the Ottoman Empire. The French had a very good relationship with the Ottomans until they decided, no, we really must do this. They came up with a flimsy pretext, that is, of the Mamluk government in Cairo, who were the governors, if you like, of this province in the Ottoman Empire. They were extorting monies from French merchants and so forth. So there was an argument that they were going to support their people trying to earn an honest living on the Nile. In the end, what they did was they created possibly the largest fleet since the invasion of Greece by Xerxes. This was twice the size of the Spanish Armada. There were 400 ships that Napoleon managed to gather at Toulon in the south of France. They say that when it was sailing, it covered some 4 square miles of the ocean surface. It was enormous. This went, believe it or not, in secret. All of the people on that fleet, they had no idea where exactly they were going. They had signed on for an adventure, but didn't know where. The troops didn't know, and they only were announced at Malta, where Napoleon said, we are now going to relieve our people on the Nile from the dreadful Mamluk government, and we know that you can defeat them easily, you great soldiers of France. This was in June of 1798. They arrived on the 1st of July, they landed, and within 30 days, they had conquered the whole of Egypt. It's quite extraordinary to imagine this, especially with the troop movements of the time. That is, people were literally marching. The armies, the Mamluks had nothing to counter the discipline of the French army at the time. Nothing could touch them. For example, the Mamluks were famous for their cavalry attacks, but the French had what they called the square formation. They would put essentially a division of men, 8,000 men, in a square, 6 ranks deep, which means each side of this fortress of men was about 200 feet long, and they all had their bayonets pointing outwards. If you can imagine a hedgehog, or a hedgerow, if you like, of bayonets, and this is what the Mamluk cavalry attacked. Worse, these fortresses could move as the French marched, and they essentially destroyed the Mamluk army. In a matter of 2 or 3 battles. And the Mamluks fought a terrible retreat all the way down to Cairo, where eventually you had the Battle of the Pyramids. And this is, it's a curious thing because Bonaparte's memoirs later on, he claims how he addressed his soldiers before the battle and said, "Soldiers, 40 centuries of history look down upon you." And all commentators say, when on earth did he say this? Because we know exactly what happened in the battle. He didn't have the time to. But this is the way Napoleon was when he wrote his memoirs. He kind of elaborated on things and made them sound better than they were, or more dramatic, because he had a great sense of history and time and magnificence and so forth, especially his own. And so looking 40 centuries looking down, I think he might have said that to his generals. I'm fairly sure he did say it, though. But and this was the fall of Egypt, effectively, for the next 3 years. And that's how it all began. The discovery of the stone, well, as you can imagine, they have conquered Egypt. The Ottomans now, of course, want it back. And they landed a force at Alexandria, at Abukir Bay, in 1799, a year later, but were immediately defeated by the French. Now, because the French knew the Ottomans were coming, they wanted to reinforce all of their coastal fortresses. At Rosetta, at the mouth of the Nile, overlooking Abukir Bay, which spans Rosetta to Alexandria, roughly, it's a very wide bay, there was an old tower known as the Burj al-Rashid. Rosetta in Arabic is al-Rashid. And so they knocked it down, they pulled it down. When they were pulling down an old rampart wall, the stones fell apart, and there in the ditch, they recognized, the officer in charge, who happened to be one of these scholars that came along. He was a scholar engineer. Noticed that it was actually an inscribed stone. It wasn't just a foundation stone. It was very dark, and he saw the inscription on it. He jumped into the ditch, brushed off the surface of it, and within moments they all knew they had found something very, very special. The Rosetta Stone is very nearly a meter long. It's, I'm mixing metric and imperial here, but it gives all the listeners a good idea, nearly a foot thick. So this thing weighs 3/4 of a ton. It's the perfect building block, if you think about it. So it's hard to understand why it would have been used in building an old fort. It had been used in the 15th century. And the thing is, there's very little stone around the delta, the Nile Delta, to build things with. So if you have broken ruins, anything as there were temples broken at Sais, which was nearby, they would have dragged the stone to the site and built their fortress out of it. And the Rosetta Stone was at the bottom. So they pulled it out of the ditch, realized they'd found something very, very important, and sent it straight down to the very new Institute of Egypt in Cairo. And it was escorted all the way by the lieutenant who discovered it, and that was Pierre Bouchard. And he is now world famous. In fact, his home in France is as equally famous as Champollions, actually. So Bouchard was quite a character by himself. And the stone made it to Cairo from there. Meanwhile, they rebuilt their fort, which became Fort Julien. History is a bit fuzzy about this. It's often known as Fort Saint Julien, Julien with two L's, or Julien with one L. It was named after an aide de camp of Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a very young officer, Officer Julien, and he was beloved by the army, absolutely adored. But he was killed just before the Battle of the Nile, which was about a month after they'd arrived. So they named the fort after him rather than the Saint Julien. So Fort Julien is the original French term for this place. It is at Rosetta overlooking Aboukir Bay. So that's how it all happened. There's stories abounded of French soldiers marching through the desert, and one of them trips over this object in the sand, and lo and behold, there is the Rosetta Stone. No, that did not happen. The other thing was that in finding this broken piece in the ditch, they thought, oh, are there any other pieces around? The work gang and the regiment scoured the area. They dug everything up, looking for anything, because they discovered that this was the most important part. The three inscriptions on the face of the Rosetta Stone, what they didn't know at the time, until they read the Greek at the very bottom, the very last line of it, they didn't realize it was the same inscription, but in three scripts in two languages, effectively. So, very briefly, at the top, you've got 14 lines of hieroglyphs. In the middle, almost intact completely, is a handwritten form of Egyptian, effectively. It was known as demotic. It's just a Greek word for popular. The Latins would call it vulgar. And at the bottom is ancient Greek. So it's kind of difficult to get your mind around this, but since Alexander the Great, Greek was the lingua franca, if you like, of the Nile Delta, especially Alexandria, for hundreds of years. So you could speak Greek to most people and they would be able to understand you, and then reply in Egyptian or what have you, or Arabic indeed. The last line of the Greek text, which the French could read, of course, said, "This inscription shall be inscribed on a stone in sacred, popular, and Greek." So I saw the hieroglyphs were the sacred writings, and the popular was the handwritten cursive demotic in the middle, and at the bottom was the ancient Greek. And they realized they had a code key. If they could correlate the ancient Greek, which they could read and decipher, with the script above, and indeed the hieroglyphs above, they might be able to crack the code of hieroglyphs. Now, when I've told people this, I'm actually quite terrible. When I'm at the British Museum and I'm standing in front of the Rosetta Stone, I start to give impromptu lectures about it. I rather annoy the British Museum guides. But anyway, when people are saying, oh my gosh, there it is, I say, well, yes, they didn't know whether you should read it right to left or left to right or up and down and so forth. And they really didn't. They knew absolutely nothing. They took nothing for granted. They even used mathematics to try to work out what the words might mean. That is, if the Greek, a Greek term was so many inches from the top or from the left or to the right, they would compare it with the demotic and try to compare it with the hieroglyphs at the top. That didn't work. They did absolutely everything they could. And these were the gang of savants that went with Bonaparte to Egypt were the cream of French academia. They were the absolute greatest minds in Europe at the time that had gone with the French. And they were stumped, absolutely stumped. Now, it's an ancient mystery because the last priests effectively died out in Egypt under the Romans. That meant there was no one left surviving who could actually decipher hieroglyphs. Nobody could tell anyone what they actually meant. Now, anyone who's visited Egypt, you see hieroglyphs everywhere. They were on every tomb, every temple, every monument. They were telling Egyptian history, but nobody could hear it. Nobody could understand it. And this was why the Rosetta Stone was so important. And it took 23 years, actually, to crack the code, even from the discovery of the stone itself.
So you write in your book that they were also looking for other examples of such multilingual inscriptions so that they could perhaps compare the Rosetta Stone with those and which could possibly help them decipher the hieroglyphs. So
Yes. It's in fact, it's quite an amusing little story about that, in that the Institute of Egypt down in Cairo, it was fairly close by, if not next door to a mosque in Nasriya. They visited the mosque and they found that the top step of the entrance to the mosque was actually a carved Rosetta Stone type stele. They thought, oh my goodness, look, we've got another one. It was just two scripts. It was just, it wasn't like the Rosetta Stone, which had three, but they thought they'd have that too. So they just started to dig it up. They dug this stone up to the howls of the imam and the people there, and they just carried it off to their institute to examine it. Then that night, the locals crept into the institute, stole it, put it back into the mosque steps. The French did it again. They went back and dug it up and took it back again. They did this several times before they finally talked to the imam and explained it, and the imam said, no, we want it back. And the French said, well, in the end, we can come and study it on your step if you don't mind. No, we don't mind. And that was that. So the stolen step was returned, at least. They found what they called the bilingual stone in Menouf. That is, it was a sheet of stone, not as thick as the Rosetta Stone. It had two scripts on it, and it was being used as a garden bench, actually, by somebody who had just put it on two stumps, and this is where he sat every day. The French stumbled on these things all the time, but none of them were as clear as the Rosetta Stone. None of them had the Greek at the bottom that they could actually read, and that was what made it so special. But in saying that, I have to explain, a lot of people don't understand the Greek at the time on that stone, on the Rosetta Stone. It's very difficult to read. It's not broken into words. You get the impression that the mason who actually carved the inscription was quite possibly Egyptian, and he was carving a foreign language as far as he was concerned. Now, imagine, for example, you don't know the script, and you just start inscribing a foreign. If I were to start inscribing Chinese, for example, I will make all sorts of errors because I don't have any knowledge of it whatsoever. You get that impression. So when you look at the Greek, you find that the French made mistakes in their translation, mistakes which they would never have made in Europe, where the Greek was laid out as on a papyrus or a paper or a document and so forth. So many scholars said, oh, look, the French, they've made terrible mistakes here. They don't really know what they're doing. Absolute nonsense. They knew exactly what they were doing. And it was very difficult to get to the bottom of the truth of the thing, essentially.
Okay, so as you mentioned earlier, the Rosetta Stone currently sits at the British Museum. So, so what happened after the discovery of the Rosetta Stone? How did it ultimately come to be possessed by the British and not the French or the Egyptians?
Well, this is the origins of lithography as well, quite literally using stones for writing. They put printer's ink on the Rosetta Stone and made printed copies, put paper on top, rolled these up and sent them back with returning troops or specialists back to France. So France had negative and positive copies they could then make of the Rosetta Stone inscription within about, I'd say, 6 months of the discovery of the stone. So its fame started to spread from then. That is when everybody knew about it. In 1800, in particular, a year later, it exploded across the continent. So you then had linguists and specialists from Paris, from Sweden, from Britain, all wanting to look at the new inscription, trying to solve the problem of hieroglyphs. When eventually the British and the Ottomans counterattacked, the French were in a very difficult position. Their army was getting smaller and smaller. They obviously could not sustain Egypt as a faraway colony. The British had cut off their supplies from France. It was only a matter of time. And that time came up in 1801. The British attacked. They landed at Alexandria, Aboukir Bay, and fought a tremendous battle just outside Alexandria. Cairo fell to the Ottomans and British expeditionary force, and Alexandria was buttoned up as a fortress and put under siege. When eventually the British general got in touch with the French general in Alexandria, he explained, "We are not coming in to accept your surrender, or indeed to relieve you of your starvation or water and so forth, until you agree to the terms of this treaty." The treaty incorporated what is known as Article 16, if I remember correctly. That is the Articles of Capitulation of Alexandria, as it's called, which is the surrender treaty for the time, stipulated that the French must release all of those treasures that they had gathered during their time in Egypt, and particularly among these, the Rosetta Stone, or the Rosetta Tablet, as they refer to it often. The French general believed that this was his own personal property, and he was a real character. He was a short, fat little man, and none of his colleagues liked him either. He had a terrible temper, and the savants, the French scholars themselves, had fallen foul of him, and at one point they tried to escape Alexandria by sneaking out in a boat. The French general, Menu was his name, tried to bombard them with field guns in the harbour until Sir William Sidney Smith, who was in charge of part of the blockade, decided to go on board the ship with the savants back into the harbour, saying that to Menu, essentially, if you try to sink the savants, you will have sunk Sir William Sidney Smith, and we will not look kindly upon that. So Menu backed off. There was endless letters back and forth between the two generals, until finally these two particular scholars from Cambridge, they were on what was known as a peregrination, a very, very long voyage. They went all the way through Europe and Russia and the Holy Land, and they wound up in Cairo, where they started speaking with the Viennese consul, who said he knew where the Rosetta Stone was in Alexandria, but he also knew of something even more valuable. So these two rushed down the Nile to Alexandria, spoke to the general, who immediately said, "Very well, you are now co-opted as my spies, and you can go in behind French lines into Alexandria and come out with the Rosetta Stone," particularly because he was fed up with this siege, wanted it to end, and he wanted the French general to give it up and surrender. In they went. Effectively, the local Alexandrians wanted the whole thing to end as well, so they helped the English. More than this, these two English scholars became very good friends with the savants and actually spoke up for them on their behalf to the British general, who wanted to confiscate all of their treasures. Now, it's not just archaeological treasures, but they had stuffed birds, reptiles, anything they had found, they were taking back to Paris to study, new species, all sorts of things like this, that the British were just going to take from them. The two British scholars, Daniel Clark and John Cripps, his student, said, no, please, we can vouchsafe, let them have their own collections, please. So the savants and the English scholars actually had a nice connection where the two generals were at loggerheads, but the savants and the English scholars they'd got together. It was a marvelous moment of cooperation. And it's at this point that you get the impression that the French actually handed the stone over. But it was not the French army that did it. It was the savants. Someone whispered in Daniel Clark's ear to go to the warehouse section in Alexandria. He wrote in his diaries essentially that with this savant officer, they found an ox cart amongst French General Menu's baggage, and they lifted up a Persian carpet, and there it was, sitting there, the Rosetta Stone. He immediately called for the British Army to come in with some engineers and artillerymen and a gun carriage. They loaded the thing onto a gun carriage, lashed it down, and took it out safely to the British lines. And that was effectively the end of French Egypt. The French troops were then escorted home. And that is why the Rosetta Stone wound up in London and not in Paris. It was spoils of war. And in fact, if you go and visit the stone, indeed you can look at this online, I'm sure, painted on the side of the stone is seized by the British Army, Egypt. So it was a trophy. As far as the army was concerned, it was a trophy. But in reality, it was handed over from one group of scholars to the other. Also, the French scholars didn't really trust Menu. They would suspect that Menu might actually be true to his word, consider it was his own personal property, and it might wind up just sitting in the foyer of his own grand home somewhere. No idea. It needed further scientific study, and they could see the writing on the wall. The British Army was outside, and here were the English scholars. Give them the stone. And that's exactly what happened.
Okay. So now coming back to the story of the deciphering of the hieroglyphs, you said earlier that it took 23 years until the hieroglyphs could be deciphered. So why don't we talk a little bit about that side of things? So what happened? So the French savants started working on it, and then several other scholars have worked on it. So could you tell us a little bit about that? Yeah.
Well, as I say, they started immediately from the printed copies, but as many of them had no reference whatsoever for hieroglyphs or even spoken Egyptian, they didn't know the difference between spoken Egyptian and Arabic, for example. And indeed, that central band of script in the middle, which is called demotic now, at the time was mistaken for Syriac or Coptic. They weren't quite sure. In the end, they created this new script for it. They call it demotic. This was worked on by Arab and Oriental specialists, particularly Sylvestre de Sacy in Paris, and Thomas Young in England had worked with a Chinese script as well. It was Young who actually came up with the idea that those names in cartouches, this is now popularly known, but effectively they are circled in hieroglyphs. He believed that these were special names, most likely the names of kings, because he had found with Chinese that Chinese script will interpret, whereas a foreign name has to be phonetic, because it would not necessarily have a meaning in the Chinese language that was writing the script, say in Mandarin, for example. So he believed the same thing of the Greek names that the Egyptians would try to write down. They couldn't, for example, give a meaning for the name Ptolemy. The best they could do was actually recreate the sounds. Therefore, he believed that those kings' names were somehow phonetic. The strangest thing about Young's work is he didn't really take it further than that. There seems to be a stop. No one really understands why. What he then later went on to do was he successfully worked with the Sacy and really translated the demotic. This was quite an achievement, but it is eclipsed largely by the work of course, Jean-François Champollion and his work on the hieroglyphs. Now, Champollion was a student of de Sacy. So one of the things I talk about in the book is it's very common when talking about the Rosetta Stone that there is an Anglo-French race, a race to decipher the hieroglyphs, to be the first ones to win this national contest. It's very hard for us to understand, but our First World War, the Great War, lasted 4 years. The Great French War, as it was known, lasted 22 years. It involved almost all of the colonies of Britain and France, and in a way you could look at it as a First World War. They desperately wanted to support their nations, and this France and England were constantly at loggerheads. They always have been. So when peace came after Waterloo, the work on the hieroglyphs really began in earnest, and they started to cooperate. Really, the scholars ignored the propaganda. Yet some, for example, Henry Salt, he really did want Young to be the first to do it so that the English could be there, but largely because also they wanted the contracts and permissions from the new Egyptian government to go into Egypt and bring more treasures back to the British Museum, more than, say, for example, the Louvre. So there was competition there too. This competition went all the way across Europe, and that when eventually Berlin was created as the capital in Germany, the new museum there was to outdo the Louvre and the British Museum. The Europeans, they were all at this constantly, struggling against each other for prestige. When Champollion when the stone was discovered, Champollion was 9 years old. He was a gifted linguist, and he grew up with the knowledge that the Rosetta Stone existed and hieroglyphs had to be deciphered. The one advantage he had over any of them was that he could speak and sing and read Coptic. He believed that spoken Egyptian actually had reference to Coptic. Therefore, he applied the same phonetic rules that Coptic had to the hieroglyphs. It still took a very long time to work. Effectively, he ran out of hieroglyphs. The Rosetta Stone has only 14 lines, and they're broken. So you can't really be sure. You need much more material. So he had explorers going up the Nile, bringing him back sheets of papyri with more and more hieroglyphs on them that he could try to pick and choose. His breakthrough came when an obelisk was discovered with a bilingual inscription on it in Greek and hieroglyphs. Now this was unusual. It was often hieroglyphs and demotic, but this was Greek and the hieroglyphs, so quite specific. And they knew that the obelisk said the names Ptolemy and Cleopatra. These two names share letters. When you look at their cartouches, you can compare the two and find those matching letters. It was a real shock to discover that effectively hieroglyphs were a combination of our own style of alphabet with logograms, pictograms, that is, ideas. So, for example, a drawing of a hawk could represent swiftness or speed or accuracy, but it could also represent the sound of a hawk, or indeed the sound of the word that a hawk would be, that you'd say in Egyptian, of the letter H, for example. It isn't, but it's just an example. This was quite a shock. They realized that they were using hieroglyphs to make specific sounds. As soon as he did this, he thought of his Coptic. And one of the first cartouches he stumbled across was one which bore what he believed was a sun. When he looked at the sun, he thought, well, in Coptic, that is Re. And he knew that the two feathers at the end of the cartouche would be the sound of two S's, the sis. And in the middle, he believed that was the mes sound, which he recognized also from Coptic, to do with harvest, I believe. When he put this together, he said, Res, Rameses, Rameses, Ramesses. He realized he had stumbled across the cartouche that could be for Ramesses. He then applied it to another cartouche. This cartouche did not have a sun. Instead, it had a picture of an ibis, the bird, the sacred ibis bird, which is very common in the Delta in particular. And of course, it is the head of the god Thoth, traditional representations, the Egyptian gods. Thoth, of course, is a Greek pronunciation of Tooth or Tut, and you'll recognize that sound from Tutankhamun. So, in a way, if you were to say Tutankhamun in Greek, you would start with Thoth Ankhamun. So, Thoth, the god here, and then Mes as well, Thoth Mes. He'd now found another famous Egyptian pharaoh, he applied all of these rules one after the other to create an alphabet. And apparently he sat up from his desk bolt upright, ran into his brother's office next door, shouted, "Je tiens l'affaire," a French version of, "By George, I think I've got it," and then passed out. He was apparently unconscious for nearly a week. It's exhaustion. And that is effectively the cracking of the code. Right there, bang, it was done. It took some years before it was proven and the full alphabet was developed and deciphered, but that was in 1822. It had taken years and years, specifically of Champellier's own work. And it was up to even German Egyptologists, Lepsius, for example, they found other stones. So there are many people who say, "Oh, I've seen the Rosetta Stone in Paris." I said, No, you haven't. I said, "Yes, I certainly did." I said, what they'd actually seen was the Canopus stone, for example, which is similar to the Rosetta Stone. It's actually in better condition, and it's complete. It's just it was made much earlier and was discovered much later. So the Rosetta Stone is still the first that was discovered and the most important as a result. It started the whole quest. And that is why it was so valuable. It was called the gem of antiquity by the English scholars.
Fascinating. So what does the Rosetta Stone say? What do those inscriptions say?
Oh, yes. I have made this in the past, and I just wish it were exciting. Like, X marks the spot. Go here, you will find the treasure. No. It's effectively a government circular. It's a little bit. It's effectively the priests writing down what Pharaoh's tax relief has promises. The promises of Pharaoh's tax relief. So the priests have promised, if you let us off this, we will set up a cult to the Pharaoh here, and it will be in this form and in these places. It was a declaration. If it were in any other culture, it would have been, for example, a notice pinned on a bulletin board. But the thing is that at the time, on the temple steps, where the sun in the right position, the very, very lightly incised carving of the stone would have been very much easier to read, and all would have known why the temple was there and why you must worship at the feet of Pharaoh.
So the question of possession or repatriation of the Rosetta Stone to its native land is a topic of hot debate, and so what's your view on that?
Well, it's a peculiar thing because almost every antiquity has its peculiar story, and you can't really apply all of the same sort of rule to every antiquity. For example, the bust of Nefertiti in Berlin at the moment, it's considered so fragile that it could actually be damaged if it were moved. That is, however, a very good argument for leaving it where it is, isn't it? The Egyptian, under the time the Supreme Council of Antiquities, under Zaki Hawass, back in 2003, I believe, delivered their demand for it to be returned. And this is something that the British Museum, it's quite difficult with the British Museum in that you're not quite sure if it is an organ of the British government, if it is a trust independently run, or it's a private operation. It's really unclear around the world. And with this demand, it was sent through the British Embassy, and they weren't really sure what to do with it. It was eventually forwarded to the keeper. They then checked the actual treaty that was signed in 1801. Now, this was actually rather staggering to me that since its arrival at the British Museum in 1802, nobody in London until 2004 had actually checked the paperwork to ensure that they did indeed own it. It sounds kind of odd, but there was just the assumption that because it was there, clearly it was theirs, But in 2004, they checked the treaty. The signatories to the treaty include a man called Osman Bey at the bottom of the list. Osman Bey was the last surviving Mamluk at the time, representing, if you like, the government of Egypt. However, he was representing the government of a military dictatorship, the Ottomans. The Ottoman army completely occupied Egypt at the time. So the idea that Osman Bey was not under any duress whatsoever to sign this document for the British to get the French out of his country is utter nonsense, really. It's if he had put any kind of struggle up, he would have been just stamped down immediately. There's no question. The idea that the Egyptian government therefore willingly handed over all of those treasures to Britain is in itself arguable in court. It's a moot point. The other thing you can ask is whether treaties or agreements between, if you like, empires that no longer exist in a context which no longer exists, when faced with modern nation states, which we are now, and we're all conscious of who we are and where we live and our country. Yet we're not in that same situation as they were in the 18th century. Why should they still apply? So my question to all of this argument of repatriation of archaeological treasures and artifacts is, at the time, they believed they had the right to acquire it. But just because of that, what gives European museums or American museums or any museum the right to retain them? No one's really addressed this yet. Now, I mentioned the bust of Nefertiti as an example. There's another one at the Louvre, which is the ceiling of the Dendra temple. These things are vast. The bust of Nefertiti is very delicate. However, of these three objects, the Rosetta Stone is without question the strongest, the most able to be shipped abroad for viewing by publics around the world. I came up with the idea, now, should it be repatriated to Egypt? Well, arguments in England have been, well, what did the Egyptians do with it? They used it as a building block. They didn't understand it. They weren't interested. And this, of course, is partly true, but it's not true as well. The French discovered it. The French deciphered it. The British preserved it. So in a way, it belongs to the history of those three nations quite intricately, and it binds them together. They have a special joint history here, Britain, France, and Egypt. So I conceived the idea that, in fact, it should be owned by the three nations in a, if you like, a sort of triple alliance, overseen perhaps by UNESCO, and it could tour between the three great museums of each nation, the Grand Cairo in Egypt and the Louvre in Paris and so forth. In fact, it has visited the Louvre, I believe, once in 1972, on the 150th anniversary of the decipherment of hieroglyphs. That was its only time. Other than that, it's been in London at the British Museum. The British Museum is more than happy for artifacts to go on tour, I was told by the keeper at the time. It's just a matter that the recipient museum has to sign an undertaking that they recognise the fact that it is the property of the British Museum. And this was the great difficulty. It's a cultural difficulty for the Supreme Council of Antiquities in Egypt to swallow that and say, yes, all right, we accept the fact it's yours. That is an awful thing to say. And a popular series of interviews, for example, just in the street, going into shops, Egyptians can be brought to almost tears when they are told about the bust of Nefertiti, and no, you can't have it back. They say, why not? It is ours. These things can be very emotive, but I think that a constantly touring exhibition, if you like, 5 years in each capital, would have been a marvelous solution to this. I dare say UNESCO would find it an administrative nightmare of liability and insurance, but it's just a thought. And of all these delicate antiquities, delicate pieces, giant pieces like the Pergamon Museum, the Pergamon altar is a building. You can't just lightly repatriate that, and you can't tour it. The Rosetta Stone could be created and toured, just like it was in 1801 and 1802. So, in this respect, it is not fair of European institutions to say, no, you don't have the facilities to take care of it anymore. You're not interested. They are interested. They do have the facilities, and you can let it go back. It's a matter now that what actually is it? In the British Museum, that stone it's a relic. It's served its purpose. It has been deciphered. Why not, in all magnanimity, hand it back and say, we give this back with grateful thanks for having enriched all of our histories, all of our pasts, and for bringing our peoples somehow, in some small way, together. In a way, that's what the stone was intended to do. It was intended for all the peoples of Egypt to be able to read it and understand it. And indeed, if they could have, they might have put it in English and French, so everyone could read it at the time. But it is, if you like, a multilingual ambassador.
So definitely the story of the Rosetta Stone, the story of the deciphering of the hieroglyphs, it was very interesting as it was complex and fascinating. So the last question that I'd like to ask you is what's the path forward from here in terms of your own research? We see how much research has gone into writing this book and collecting all the information that has made its way into the book. So are you still working on it? Do you plan on an extension
I'll plan on
of this book?
a third edition. No, in fact, the second edition from Cairo came up because of a glaring omission in the first edition, which was the Arabic scholars, the work of Islamic science, in that it was understood by the Christian Europeans that fundamental Islam did not want to know about these pagan inscriptions in Egypt. And this is just not true. The Caliph of Baghdad, for example, commissioned studies. The great Dual Nun, he lived like Champollion in temple ruins, driving himself mad, trying to decipher hieroglyphs. And in fact, Ibn Washia got so far as a partial alphabet. So these were 1,000 years, roughly, before Champollion. But because of the divide, the cultural divide, European science didn't know. Islamic science had effectively informed European science in medicine, anatomy, surgery, all of these things for centuries. Arabic doctors and surgeons their work was followed to the letter in Europe. But for some reason, the work on ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs just passed people by. However, it is understood that Sylvestre de Sacy, who could speak and read Arabic, knew very well about this, and he must have told Champollion. So it's a very contentious topic at the moment that Arabic nations are saying, no, look, we did work on this too. And also, we believe Champollion used our work and didn't mention it at all. Well, it's more than likely Champollion was aware of the Arabic scholars' work. It is also more than likely that Champollion just dismissed anyone else's work out of hand. He was a terrible braggart and very headstrong and full of himself. In fact, he alienated de Sacy, his tutor, quite regularly. De Sacy even warned Sir Thomas Young, don't correspond with young Champollion, he'll just take your work and use it for his own ends. All these sorts of things, typical academic rivalry stuff. But the truth is that Coptic and Arabic must have informed Champollion's thinking, and it did help. Arabic scholarship did do work that did lead, in the end, to some further understanding. And that's what I wanted to add to the book at the time. A third edition? At the moment, no plans really, but I have been, if you like, fictionalizing the story to put into novels. So we have more of this, and I really, really just wanted the whole story to be digestible so that everybody could read it, everybody could become fascinated by it and read about Nelson at the Battle of the Nile, and Napoleon at the pyramids, and it's an extraordinary story. It was the greatest adventure of the age. And in fact, when the French packed their ships ready to go to Egypt, you could equate it to a NASA mission to Mars. It felt like that. When you read the actual comments of people who went, they say, we have no idea where we're going, but we cannot wait to get there.
Okay, awesome. So we'll wait for that, uh, and that was very interesting. Thank you very much for joining us. It was it was a great pleasure.
Great pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much.